Weak institutions are to blame for Africa's stunted growth and structural transformation. At least that's what the conventional wisdom is. But is this the case? On tonight's program, we're joined by Professor Lant Pritchett of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, who will explain his theory on how we can reframe this discussion around rules and deals, and what the implications are for growth, both here in Africa and globally. Professor Pritchett, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So we just want to start off with this kind of broad explanation of your idea that looking at institutions as weak might not be conducive, and you have an alternative kind of vocabulary and way of looking at it. Could you please outline that just to start us off?
So I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that growth in developing countries has a dynamic in which countries grow very fast and then they stagnate, they sometimes collapse and have large extended recessions or depressions. And by and large, countries don't fail to grow or fail to start to grow because they have weak institutions. So having what people call weak institutions is actually not a barrier to initiating episodes of rapid growth. The really tricky part is how to, during an episode of rapid growth that's been generated, sustain that growth over time and not have it end in a collapse, which means you need to think, how do I start a growth episode and then during that episode build the strength of the institutions over time. So I think the idea that institution reform comes first and drives growth is just not accurate. I've done work on identifying the biggest episodes of growth, what countries have grown the most and added the most to their GDP per capita. And essentially none of those episodes were initiated by what one would call a major improvement in institutions. They're initiated by a variety of things, but not by, in some sense, some dramatic improvement in institutions. The ones that last the longest are the ones in which you generate a positive feedback loop between the nature and pattern of growth and institutions such that you can sustain the growth. So I think just asking the growth question right conditions what kinds of answers we're looking for. And I think when people talk about institutions, you could imagine that fixing the institutions was a necessary prerequisite of starting growth, and that's just not true.
I mean, we should recognize that you are here at the annual research workshop of Rapport, and you gave a very interesting paper on this different way of framing that discussion in terms of rules world versus a deals world. Could you please outline what that means in the context of this discussion at least?
So, in a rules world, you can predict with some accuracy what will happen just by looking at the rule. And what is a rule? A rule is, if the fact is this, this will happen, right? So in a rules world, you might say, here's the procedure for getting a driver's license. If I follow that procedure, I will get a driver's license. If I don't follow that procedure, I won't get a driver's license. Or here are the rules about taxation. If I follow those rules, I will pay the following tax, and if I don't follow those rules and pay those following tax, bad things will happen to me. That's a rules world. That's the world that the US, Germany, Japan live in, for the most part. And in every, there's more deals than you would think. A deals world is a world in which what happens to you is predicted on the basis of what you do, who you are, as well as what the rule is. So for instance, some colleagues of mine have done a study about how people actually get a driver's license in New Delhi, India. The rules look exactly like the rules in the US or Europe. You know, you have to prove your age, you have to prove you can drive. What really happens in India, or at least at this particular period that they did the study, is people hired a facilitator. They hired a tout to facilitate getting a driver's license. Well, what happened? When you hired a tout, 95% of the people who hired a tout never took the driving exam. So essentially, the rule that said you had to demonstrate you could drive to get the driver's license was completely flouted in practice. So if we described how you get a driver's license, we could say, well, do you want me to describe the nominal legal rules, or do you want me to describe what really happens? And that's the deals. Now, what I've done a piece of research where I and some co-authors, we've compared how businesses do business, and we are able to compare what the law says regulatory compliance would take and what firms actually do. And what we find around the world, across countries in the world, there's zero relationship between what the law says and what firms report. So for instance, they do a study that says, here's how many days it would take a firm to get a permit to build a building. Yeah. Then we ask firms, if they build a building, how long the permitting process took. Yeah. The average of the law is 180 days. The average of the reality is 30. So it says, well, if you followed the law, it would take you 6 months. It really only took you a month. Yeah. The reason it only took you a month is that there's a deals process. And moreover, what we found is that within countries, there was massive variance across firms. So if the law said it took you 180 days to get a permit, some firms got it in a week. Yeah. Some firms, it took them a year. So a huge variation across firms, such that comparing in some sense the rules across country is almost irrelevant. Yeah. A short phrase is, it's not where you are, it's who you are. Yeah. If I'm predicting how long it will take me to get a permit to build a building, I should ask myself, who am I? What's my relationship to the people that regulate this process? What am I going to do to facilitate the process? What kind of brokers might I participate with? Not asking what the rule is almost irrelevant to what the prediction of what will actually happen. So now what that means is, oftentimes people say, in order to develop, you need to be in rules world. And I think that's got it exactly backwards. Meaning, if you're in rules world, you are developed, yes, but you don't get to being developed and you don't get to growth by necessarily having to get to rules world first. We can show that there are spaces within the deals world that are actually very conducive to economic growth.
Oh, well, that leads on very nicely to the next question that we have. So what are now the implications for growth? Because the conventional wisdom would be rules equals growth because that's predictable, it's sustainable.
Right.
You could broadly associate it with what we'd call strong institutions.
Exactly.
Whereas with the deals, this is now the informal, the shifty, the shady, the kind of the edge of what the rules are. But from what you're kind of implying here, it's actually not so straightforward.
I think it's not at all straightforward because I think people have been very confused and confusing about the dynamics. So let me answer a more technical question and get back to the implications. Sure. So, because if we look across countries in the world, it is true that countries that are richer tend to have strong institutions and countries that are poorer in levels tend to have weaker institutions. But it's not true in the data that if we look at any given 20-year period, say, that countries that had stronger institutions grew faster than countries that had weaker institutions. So people elide the distinction between the level of income and the growth of income. So in fact, it's perfectly possible to have weak institutions, to not be in deals world, and yet grow very fast. But again, the risk is if you're growing very fast in deals world, sometimes that ends in a very nasty way. So the implication of this is that countries should think about the function, not the form. Because I think the rhetoric of strong institutions has led people to conflate and confuse the form with the function.
So it looks right. And
so it looks right. So for instance, one way of providing predictability to investors is to have solid rules that are well enforced. Because then I can predict what will happen to my investment based on the rules. But that's not the only way to provide predictability, right? So for instance, and then there are good and bad ways to provide predictability without rules. So for instance, I lived in Indonesia just after the period where Suharto had resigned, and Suharto had ruled Indonesia for 30 years. If you were part of the favored firms in the Suharto regime, which was certain ethnic Chinese conglomerates, the military, certain family firms around Suharto, you had enormous predictability. Yeah. The problem with deals wasn't that that meant that these firms didn't have predictability. In some in some sense, these firms had super predictability because they could predict with some accuracy. They would always get the most favorable possible treatment. Better, by the way, than the law, right? There's a famous saying out of Latin America, for my friends, anything, for my enemies, the law. So many countries actually have a law that's very hostile to private business, but a practice that's very, very favorable to favored firms. So we make the distinction between ordered deals and disordered deals. Certainly some kinds of deals environment, like the informal sector in many countries, by evading contact with the state apparatus and the regulatory apparatus, they push themselves into an environment that's very unpredictable. So this is what we call disordered deals, and it's what we call open disordered deals. Anybody can, as far as I would guess, anybody can, open a small-scale shop on the side of the road and start selling, bicycle repair services or, food for construction sites, right? There's essentially no regulation of that. And so we call that open, but probably disordered deals, because you can't really predict what will happen, because a regulator might come by and enforce. They might throw you off the site. Somebody might come and... Okay. And then there's ordered deals. And then within ordered deals, there's closed and open. Okay? So, in fact, many of the episodes of rapid growth have been associated with ordered deals. Now, the key issue is whether your ordered deals, that is, we're actually treating some firms better than other firms. Whether that ordered deals environment tends towards rules or tends to weaken your institutions is the key factor.
Sure. And I just wanted to ask now, because although we've been discussing this in terms of growth, we have a great push here in Africa, but certainly globally, of a word that brings up a lot of different reactions in people. But if we want this growth to be inclusive and sustainable, this now shifts your discussion, presumably. So what does that mean now that we need to focus more on growth and we'll deal with inclusiveness and so on, which are usually the rules part of it, or do we need the growth and then the rules come, or do we need to ensure that they're kind of happening at the same time? Like how do you kind of get this relationship, as it were?
I think this is the difficult part, which is if you look at, essentially, to create high levels of investment that are necessary and progress that are necessary for economic growth, you need to create a predictable and favorable environment for investors. Meaning they have to say, I'm going to invest some money and I'm going to make some money and recoup some profits. Otherwise, people don't invest. Okay? Now, for sure, one way of creating a favorable, predictable environment is to create an environment that benefits the cronies of people in power. If you're stably in power, you can say to favored firms, and whether they be a favored ethnic group or firms owned by the military apparatus or firms that are chosen as part of the political party funding apparatus, you can favor those firms and create a predictable, attractive investment. Okay. Now, there's two elements of inclusive that then come into play. One is you're obviously favoring some firms and not others. So all kinds of people don't have access to the same opportunities. That often leads, and this gets back to the growth dynamics, often if you have a closed order deal growth episode, it ends in a revolution. Because eventually the people that are excluded from access to the favorable treatment resent it. And eventually, so there's a path in which you start with closed order deals, but those deals become more open, more contestable people, more people in some sense have access to this favorable treatment, and the favored part of the economy gets bigger and bigger, and that starts from closed order deals and moves towards rules. That's one path. Countries, I would argue most countries that have been successful actually started on that path. So Korea in 1962 did not start with strong rule of law. It started with a limited number of identifiable chaebol firms that the government formed partnerships with that said, we want you to export, we will provide favorable treatment in order for you to export with respect to a variety of factors, but you've got performance targets. And then that part of the economy got bigger and bigger and more open. So if eventually you don't provide inclusiveness. That's why, in some sense, developing countries have such extraordinarily growth dynamics, because what happens is the closed order deal can blow up into complete disorder. And you see this all the time, where there'll be one regime, there'll be actually reasonably good economic progress, but it differentially benefits a small group. Boom, that blows up politically because of that exclusion. And then it's very hard to reestablish treatment from anybody, because after all, the whole economy was based on deviation from the rules and the law and favorable treatment for the few. So a politics to reestablish any kind of predictability becomes very hard, and then the disorder does in fact cause unstable economic growth. So you make these growth shifts as part of political backlash against it. On the other hand, countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia have actually managed the narrow progress of getting more and more open, including more and more actors into a contestable deal space.
And what about the idea of...
And eventually that process ends in rules. Because in our view, rules should be the result of the consolidation of existing deals. As you say, how are deals done? How are they successful? Well, let's make that the rule. As opposed to starting for some arbitrary rule that Germany has or France has. Say, oh my gosh, that's the best practice rule. Let's adopt it in Tanzania. That's always going to go wrong.
Well, it kind of leads into the question I was going to ask. Now, do you ever kind of slide, not backward, but do you ever slide from rules to deals then? I mean, what does that dynamic ever happen, and is that necessarily an undesirable?
I think it is undesirable, and very few countries do, to be honest. If you look at countries that have actually achieved reasonable, people who study institutions like Douglas North, he talks about open access orders and limited access orders. And what you find is, in fact, very little backsliding. Usually once countries have developed high levels of productivity and prosperity on the basis of achieving rule of law as the primary way in which expectations are formed, very few countries backslide. That said, no one should kid themselves that within a basically rules economy, there isn't an enormous industry in trying to influence how those rules are implemented. I mean, go to Washington, D.C., around the city of Washington, D.C. are all these $1 million mansions, and you say, what do these people produce that they get paid $1 million? They produce deals, is what they produce. So even the most rules-oriented economies, still there's influence into the way the rules are done, and all firms spend an enormous amount of time massaging the rules environment so it treats them as favorably as possible. So that the deals aspect never goes away. It just becomes less and less a part to where most transactions are mostly rules. But again, deals remain an important part. But I think people like Donald Trump, who want to turn America into more of a deals-based thing, I think that's a backsliding in a very bad way. And it rarely happens. But the transition from deals to rules is very hard, because there are many ways to go wrong.
Well, it's kind of, in a way, a kind of nice final kind of question. This idea again of, as you'd mentioned, actually it's a series of deals that eventually become the rules. So that's kind of, let's say we're in Tanzania, this is growth with Tanzanian characteristics. Why, in your opinion, why aren't more people taking that kind of a stance? Like, why do we have this way of saying this is best practice and it works in Germany and therefore it will work here? I mean, what you seem to be describing here is a very pragmatic way of looking at institution building, to use that rhetoric. So why do we not accept that, or why is that not the norm in your kind of experience?
I'm going to say some things I probably shouldn't say on camera. So, one reason is that people confuse people who live in a prosperous country with people who know what they're talking about. Most people from developed countries, from rich countries, have no idea why their country's rich. And so asking those people how to make a country rich is like asking a taxi driver to design an internal combustion engine. They have no idea how a taxi works. They just drive it. Most people from rich countries rely on institutions they didn't didn't build, and they have no understanding of.
how they came
So you
about.
get all these foreigners coming here and saying, I'm from a rich country, and here's how we do it in our rich country, therefore here's how you should do it. They have no idea what they're talking about. They're taxi drivers telling you how to design an internal combustion engine. They're not institution designers. They're users of institutions that they have inherited. And it's sort of like, I use machines all the time. I use a smartphone all the time. I have no idea how to design a smartphone, but I can use one successfully. So most of the people giving policy advice are users of institutions they didn't build, and hence they have no idea how to do it. So, and I think people in developing countries have paid entirely too much attention to those people, given those people too much deference. So the next time anybody tells you how to build an institution, say, did you build the institution in Germany? And they'll say, well, actually, no, it's been there for 100 years. Well, send me somebody from 100 years ago that built it, and I'll listen to them, right? Because how these countries built their institutions was through a very much iterative, let's start with deals and work towards rules process. And the rules that I inherit today as an American citizen were contested and struggled and fought over in a hotly contested deals environment 100 years ago. And now I've inherited the accumulation of that process. But if I weren't a specialist in development, I would no more understand that than I understand how a smartphone works at the design level. Right? I understand how it works at the operational level, but not at the design level. So first of all, I think there's been a lot of people who are giving you extraordinarily bad advice because they have no idea what they're talking about. They're taxi drivers. They're not taxi designers. They're not car designers. Second is there's this process which is related. There's this process called isomorphism. And I think you can understand isomorphism by thinking about animals using camouflage. Right? The cheetah has all these spots. Why does the cheetah have all these spots? Well, in part so when it's sneaking up on its prey, it doesn't see it. Right? I think developing country governments have been willing to use camouflage.
To look like a state.
To look like a state, right? In the famous words of James Scott has a book. Oh, no, James Scott has a famous book called Seeing Like a State. I have a paper called Looking Like a State, right? Let's say I have a completely corrupted police force, but if they wear uniforms, have some hierarchical structure with ranks on their uniform, it looks like a police force, right? But many countries have a police force that looks exactly isomorphic. Isomorphic just means maps one to one. Looks exactly like a police force in Germany, but that's organized crime, right? Their police force isn't really a policing force, it's organized crime. It organizes the crime in the country. Form over substance. Right? And so it's exactly form over substance. And I think developing country governments in their interaction with the rest of the world have found it very useful to project certain isomorphism of best practice in order to deflect, and I think a lot of the world is willing to believe that what the camouflage is being projected is the truth and just go along with the mirage. So I think some of the most ingenious fiction in the world are the factual reports written by donors. It's just ingenious fiction, which is just a concerted effort to look the other way and ignore what's really happening in favor of the reality that's being projected. And the third thing is, it's very difficult to say you're going to do it your own way. And let me use again, everything I've said in the last little segment's controversial. Paul Kagame. He came into power after an incipient and near genocide in Rwanda. He had to deal with the fact that, millions of people had been complicit in this genocide. And the Westerners all came in and said, oh, there's criminal activities, you need criminal courts. And you need criminal courts with due process, and you need criminal courts with attorneys and judges. And Paul Kagame said, you got to be kidding. I can't lock my country up in a judicial process where 1 out of every 7 citizens of my country is under threat of some criminal process and use all my resources for judges and attorneys. We Rwandese actually have traditional processes of resolving disputes. For the high-level organizers of the genocide, we'll use the legal process. For the rest, we're going to use these traditional procedures. We as a country and a society have always had ways of resolving disputes. We're going to use that to resolve this. He got enormous pushback because that wasn't the gold standard of how legal and justice procedure should happen.
But it worked for that society.
It worked for that society in that context. But it took a lot of, he was under a lot of pressure from a lot of forces to do the gold standard when it wasn't going to work. He couldn't afford it. It would have tied his society up into continued conflict for years and years. Whereas, again, I am sure there were injustices done and not remediated, and I'm sure there were lots of things that didn't happen, but he was able to reconsolidate a society that could start from scratch and has successfully made progress. So I think, but there are enormous pressures in some sense to have rules more sophisticated and more difficult than the actual practices that can be sustained because other countries have them. And I think that's just a pernicious effect. And it takes some strength and vision as a leader to say, no, we have a way of doing it in my country. We're going to do it that way. We'll get to your way maybe, but let us get to our way through function, not through premature adoption of form.
Well, we usually end the show with letting the guest have a last word. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience on what we've discussed so far, or maybe some of your other observations or stuff you're working on again that builds on this work that you have done so far?
So I have been working on, I just published a book, and I'm willing to promote my book because it's open access, so it's freely available to everyone. And it's actually called Building State Capability, and it's precisely about organizations. Because many institutions are enforced by organizations, and there's a difference between an institution and an organization. But one of the problems in the world is that, the public sectors around the world don't have enough capability. They're not able to enforce the policies and the rules and the regulations. And we think, by and large, much of the development advice is given very bad advice on how to build capability. And we have an approach to building capability called problem-driven iterative adaptation, which we call PDIA because everything in the development space needs an acronym, and it has to be 3 or 4 letters. So PDIA is our acronym, problem-driven iterative adaptation, and it's kind of an embodiment of this approach. It's a series of techniques for saying, rather than starting from thinking as a leader you're implementing a solution, you should think of yourself as a leader as creating space for problems to get solved.
So for a solution to emerge.
And for a solution to emerge from a process of problem solving, rather than thinking, I'm the leader, my job is to come up with a solution and tell everybody what to do. Rather, as a leader, you should say, let's help define the problem. Let's allow people space and latitude to come up with solutions of the problem that are locally generated, right? Locally nominated problems, locally generated solutions, feedback loops on whether it works, and then scaling up through diffusion. If you find something that works, start doing more of it. If you find something doesn't work, change its design, change the way you're doing it. And we believe that this is building capability by delivering results. I think a lot of the mentality has been, we're going to build institutions or build organization capability and then do something. So we can have a civil service reform that in some sense is content neutral. We don't know what we're going to do with the civil service, but we'll build its capability and then it will do something. We think that's the wrong approach. We should say, what do you need to get done? Build the capability to do that and focus on building the capability to do that. And by delivering those results, you'll build the capability you need to then deliver the next thing. So I think we have, this book is available, Building State Capability, Oxford University Press. I'm not making any money because it's open access. Anybody can download it for free. And we've developed a set of courses, online courses, that use the book materials to walk people through the steps they can take in their organization. Because I think getting the institutional structures right, but even once you have the institutional structure right, you need to worry about the nitty-gritty of the organizations as well.
Sure. Well, on that note, thank you very much for coming on the program, and welcome again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.